Well, thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you to Sue for inviting me. I feel quite honored to be here today at the opening of this think tank. And I should also say thank you for my first earthquake as well. That was great. I woke up at 4 a.m. I had no idea what was going on, but just sort of lulled back to sleep. So yeah, it's quite an honor to be here, and I feel like I've been very impressed by everything I've seen coming out of speaking with people from ESRA, speaking with activists here in New Zealand. Now what I want to talk about today is think tanks after neoliberalism. And I want to sort of set think tanks in terms of the history of think tanks within neoliberalism, but also their role today. So it's often thought that neoliberalism began in the 1970s. Or in New Zealand, Rogernomics in the 1984 onwards. But actually, neoliberalism as an idea began much earlier. In the 1930s, and even in the 1920s, arguably. And it began with a small group of quite marginal thinkers. This is the interesting part, is that these people were considered cranks for the most part. They struggled to get jobs. They were mocked by the rest of academia. They were mocked by the policy world. But 50 years later, they had basically changed the entire world. And what I find quite interesting is exactly how did this small group of people go from a marginal position to controlling the rest of the world. And the story begins with a small group of people. People like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Walter Lippmann. And they were surrounded in the 1930s by either socialist ideas or the emerging sort of Keynesian ideas of how to deal with things like recessions. But in either case, the state was basically dominant in the economy. And for these people, this was basically the road to totalitarianism, the road to fascism. And so they wanted to create a new liberalism. It wasn't yet a neoliberalism, but they wanted something different. They wanted to think, how do we develop a liberalism under these sorts of conditions? But they recognized it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be a long-term task in order to get any sort of liberalism to emerge out of that period. So they first started in 1938. They meet in Paris. They draw up all these plans for what they can do over the coming years. And then, of course, World War II happens. So that project sort of stalls out. But once World War II is over and done with in 1945, Hayek ends up meeting the Swiss businessman randomly, and he convinces this businessman, support me financially, and we can build this project for a new liberalism. So in 1947, what happens is that all the creators of neoliberalism, every famous person associated with neoliberalism, meets at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. And this is sort of the heart, the origin story of neoliberalism. So what is MPS, the Mont Pelerin Society? Well, it's an intellectual meeting place in the first instance. And what they aim to do is to build and then install a neoliberal hegemony. Now, they needed to do a few different things in order to achieve this. The first was they had to change political common sense. And this is a very Gramscian point. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, he says, well, society is not just governed by coercion and violence, the sort of fist of the state. Instead, power also rules through consent. And it rules by creating common senses that enable people to see themselves as benefiting from a particular order. So Hayek, without even reading Gramsci, sort of recognizes this as well. There's a certain common sense, the Keynesian and socialist common sense at his time, and he recognizes that we need a new neoliberal common sense. And he has to get people on board with the project. He has to get people to buy into a radically different social order. So this involves changing the common sense, involves creating new ideas. Now to do that, it's not going to happen quickly. And Hayek recognized very early that it was going to be a long-term project. It wasn't something that was going to happen overnight. There was actually a massive debate within the Mont Pelerin Society about whether they should be trying to do things immediately or whether they should be trying to plan for a couple of decades. And Hayek decides, no, it has to be a long-term project. So a quote from him, our effort therefore differs from any political task in that it must be essentially a long-run effort, concerned not so much with what would be immediately practicable, but with the beliefs which must gain ascendance if the dangers are to be averted, which at the moment threaten individual freedom. And I think this is quite interesting because this gives up on the immediately practical. It gives up on the sort of binding element of the common sense, which is to say that you can only do what is practical today. Hayek resisted that. And Hayek knew that he would have to change what is actually practical. And this involved creating ideas, primarily. And then what happens with these ideas is summed up nicely by Milton Friedman. So he says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And you can see that this is exactly what the neoliberals did. They spent 40 years building up a whole series of ideas, an entirely different alternative worldview, and then the 1970s happens. And at that point, they've got an answer to the problems. And they've got their ideas set out for policymakers and people to pick up at hand. Now, how did they get their ideas out? And this is where the crucial role of think tanks comes in. So, uniquely, in any political movement, neoliberalism made use of think tanks to a massive extent. Now, the Fabian Society in the UK had originally developed the idea of think tanks, and they used them to some degree, but they never made them essential the way that the neoliberals did. So they developed and they nurtured numerous think tanks around the entire world. They were so obsessed with think tanks that they created a think tank to institutionalize the production of think tanks. So this thing called the Atlas Foundation, which if you go to their website, you can find this chart here, this map. This is over 400 think tanks that the Atlas Foundation has produced around the world. And this is neoliberalism, the heart of neoliberals' ideological infrastructure. So basically, they obsessively and meticulously create these think tanks to get these ideas out in every single country around the world. And this is how they changed ideological common sense, by the constant and persistent elaboration of these ideas. And so think tanks were used to create a new common sense over the long term. And think tanks were essentially an infrastructure for ideological diffusion. So one of the people mostly associated with this, Anthony Fisher, he says the most difficult task is not the production of ideas, but their diffusion. And I think this is a really crucial point to make. We can, as academics, imagine all sorts of great ideas, but the problem is, how do we get them out to people? How do we change common sense? Think tanks serve a crucial role in achieving that. Now, interestingly, within the Mont Pelerin Society, this involved a number of different approaches. So, different think tanks doing different things at different times. Some were involved in long-term planning. They were highly speculative, borderline utopian. Basically, what would the world look like if everything was a free market, the sort of libertarian dream? You had other think tanks which were more focused on medium-term ideas. So how do you build entire policy platforms for an upcoming election in 5 years? And then you had short-term think tanks, people that were focused on the issues of the day. So what is a major policy issue of the day? What is the neoliberal response to it? And basically what the Mont Pelerin Society did was to have all these think tanks doing all these different efforts at the same time. So they're building this up, and then the 1970s happens. You get stagflation across the economies, and basically it's this massive moment of confusion for economists and for policymakers. Nobody quite knows what's going on. Nobody quite knows how to solve it. And part of the interest of neoliberalism at the time was that it did seem to offer a way out of the problems. Keynesian solutions didn't offer a way out, but neoliberalism did promise a way to solve the 1970s crisis. And so, unsurprisingly, these ideas get picked up. But this isn't just something which happens overnight. This is the product of decades of work. And this is what I think one of the major things we can learn from the Mont Pelerin Society. Now, there's a number of different aspects, I think, that we can also learn from them. One is that think tanks have a unique position in politics. And this is a separation from the sort of immediate demands of everyday politics. So they have a separation from the pressures of the electoral cycle. They don't have to worry about what a 5-year goal might look like. They don't have to worry about whether or not voters might enjoy the ideas right now. But they're also separate from the immediate pressures of activism. They aren't trying to change things right away. Instead, they are taking the long-term perspective. And I think this is what think tanks have as a unique function, is to have long-term strategic foresight. Other political actors have certain demands on them that don't allow them to think long-term in the same way, but think tanks do. They can stand out from the rest of politics, and they can do that long-term thinking, which is absolutely essential to any sort of major social change. Now, this involves creating narratives in the first place. It involves creating a story which explains to people what has gone wrong. It involves picking out who are the enemies. It involves what needs to change, and it involves images of the future that are desirable and enticing to people. Ultimately, it involves a whole new language. I think a good example of this is the Occupy movement, which did have an analysis of what exactly is wrong with the world, massive inequality. It picked out the enemies, the 1%, and then it gave some ideas for how to change that. It created a whole new language that we're still using years later. So these are the sort of things that think tanks have a primary role in. Think tanks are also useful for changing the Overton window. Now, the Overton window is basically the idea that within politics at any given moment, there's only a certain set of ideas that are considered politically possible. If you step outside the bounds of the Overton window, you're deemed a radical, an extremist, naive, utopian, silly. It basically puts constraints on what gets counted as serious politics. So changing the Overton window, changing the conception of what is possible, is a crucial task for think tanks to do. And all of this ends up producing the importance of think tanks to massive hegemonic change. So we move from the Keynesian era of social democracy to neoliberalism, and what do we do from there? This is what think tanks can do. And when the Mont Pelerin Society was working on changing that hegemony, they came up with a whole set of new terms, new ideas. The very meaning of the word freedom changes under neoliberalism. The idea of what it means to be a citizen or a subject changes. Suddenly we're all competitive individuals, responsible for our own situation in life. And then the role of the state and the market change as a result of these neoliberal think tanks. So this is what we can learn from the Mont Pelerin Society, but I don't think the left can just replicate the Mont Pelerin Society. In the first part, as was mentioned, we don't have the resources. We can't go coddling up to businesses to get lots of money unless we want to sell out. But I think a more sort of fundamental and insidious problem is the sort of risk of turning into an intellectual vanguard. So Mont Pelerin Society was premised upon changing the common sense of elite networks. It didn't focus as much on changing the common sense of everyday people. Instead, it tried to convince businessmen and politicians, the people in power, the ruling classes. It decided to change their common sense. Now, the left can't focus on that. I think the risk is that if the left just follows the Mont Pelerin model, it risks becoming technocratic and top-down. So the risk is that the think tank becomes just an intellectual vanguard. And the classic idea of a vanguard is that we know best, we're the most intelligent, we'll tell everybody else what to do. I think that's a real risk for any leftist think tank, is to just presume that you are the sort of brain of the entire operation. And the idea is that, well, basically, because you have the right theory about the world, you don't need to learn from anybody. You just have to go out and tell people and convince people of your already true theory. So it basically becomes intellectuals telling people what to do. And this is a real risk. So the question is how to avoid this. Well, I think one way is that you have to reject organizational fetishism. So organizational fetishism, I basically take to mean the idea that one particular type of organization will solve all of our problems. So you see it in people who argue about anarchist groups and affinity groups. You see it in people who argue that trade unions will solve everything. And you see it in the way in which sometimes think tanks are presumed to solve everything. I think instead we have to recognize that any matter of social change is going to come about from an ecology of organizations and not just any one organization. Now the question becomes, how do you relate to other elements of that ecology? How do you relate to other movements and to other parties? Now I think we see experiments with new hybrid forms of organizations around the world right now. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the post-2008 era is precisely the rise of a whole series of hybrid organizations. This is a scene from a Podemos rally, which is a pretty good example of one of these hybrid formations. But we also see unions trying to take on social movement aspects, trying to do community organizing, trying to mobilize around things like evictions and housing, rather than just workplace concerns. We see parties trying to merge with social movements. Podemos is a great example, but there's also a great example in the UK right now with Momentum and the Labour Party, which is an odd sort of case where Momentum is trying to produce a social movement in an almost top-down manner. We'll see how it goes. I should say I'm hopeful. It sounds bizarre, but I am hopeful. But I think think tanks also need to consider how to become a more hybrid organization, how to relate to other aspects of this ecology. Now, I think the problem is, the big challenge is, if think tanks are fundamentally oriented towards long-term strategic thinking, how do you reflect the concerns of other groups outside of the think tank, rather than simply imposing an external viewpoint on them? I think ultimately this is the question of strategy. Now, if you had a sort of classic vanguard party, you had a very simple solution to this problem of strategy. The vanguard was the smart people. They came up with the correct vision of the world, the correct theory of what to do, and then they told everybody else what to do and to follow that line. Now, this doesn't work, though. This doesn't work anymore. So how does a think tank operate? How does it produce strategy without simply dictating to people that we've got the right theory? Now, I think we can accept that think tanks do provide leadership, but they don't do so in the same way as traditional vanguards. And now as leaders, they serve a pedagogical function. They try and educate people, think tanks, they try and educate people about their own situation. They try to provide a grand narrative to make sense of people's lives. And they try to give meaning and orientation to the struggles that people are already undertaking. But I think the key thing is that leadership doesn't just lie with any one organization. Leadership should be thought of more as something that actually moves about in this ecology of organizations. So let me give one example here, which is the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Now, Black Lives Matter was not a formal institution to begin with, but in so many ways, it has led the political movements in the US in all sorts of interesting directions. And I think what you have here is a spontaneous movement which spontaneously takes on that leadership role. And I think under those sorts of circumstances, think tanks need to recognize that groups outside of them can become the leaders. So think tanks need to be willing to relinquish the institutional sort of privilege accorded to them. They must allow themselves to learn from social movements. And this means things like reaching out to them, discussing with them, not to co-opt them or to educate them, but instead to be educated by them. So I think this involves connecting with what Gramsci called the organic intellectuals. These are the people who are involved in the movements, who are spontaneously producing the theories and ideas that are organizing these movements. So rather than a top-down imposition of ideas, think tanks need to be open to being educated. So I think this is a type of leadership that's still involved here, but it's one that involves any sort of charismatic leadership, and it also doesn't involve any sort of hierarchical relationships. But it still allows for processes of learning, of organizing, of coordinating, and strategizing. So I think this pedagogical relationship is fundamental to the ways in which think tanks coordinate with other groups. That being said, what do think tanks need to do today? I think the fundamental task is to build what comes after neoliberalism. I'm going to make the perhaps contentious claim that I think neoliberalism is actually dead right now. Now, after 2008, everybody said neoliberalism was dead, and then we had this massive wave of austerity, and it seemed like neoliberalism was just continuing on at an even harsher pace. I think austerity is done and over with, though, and I think it's being increasingly recognized around the world by both governments and organizations that neoliberalism is actually dead. Now, I think the problem is the right wing is already developing alternatives. I think Donald Trump can be seen as an alternative to neoliberalism. He's pushing back against free trade. He's pushing back against excessive greed. He's pushing against the free movement of people. And he's trying to help, in some way, some bizarre way, the losers of globalization. They just usually happen to be white. In the UK, we see a similar thing with Theresa May. Theresa May is talking about industrial policy, which is completely opposite to neoliberalism. She's talking about getting out of the free market in the EU, which is completely opposite to neoliberalism. This is a right wing. It's a new right-wing formation, which is something different than what we've been seeing over the past 30 or 40 years. The challenge is the left needs to build up its own alternative. It's not easy, obviously, but let me give a few suggestions about what it might look like. In the first place, and I think sort of central to any vision of a left alternative to neoliberalism, is that we have to make the argument for higher taxes across the board. We need the money to be able to do other things, and this is sort of fundamental to any sort of alternative hegemony. Now, this can mean things like carbon taxes. It can mean things like inheritance taxes. It can mean things like taxes on capital. It doesn't have to be borne by the working class or the middle classes. I think a leftist alternative to neoliberalism also involves a reduction of work. If you've read my book, that's no surprise. This is to stimulate productivity, it's to stimulate creativity, it decreases mental and physical stress, it also responds to the threat of automation, and it responds to the crisis of care that is going to be happening as societies get older and older. I think we also need to be making the argument that the state needs to lead investment. A famous book now from Mariana Mazzucato points out that the iPhone, every key technology of the iPhone, was actually funded and led by the state. I think we need to have a high-tech state that is actually pushing at the edges of innovation, not for profit, but to actually better people's lives. And finally, we need to be talking about greater democratic control over the state's priorities. We need to be talking about public ownership, but not just public ownership, public control over industries and companies. And we need to be talking about digital democracy, the various ways in which these new tools can allow us to have more say over the everyday actions of the state. Now, I think we're in an interesting moment. Neoliberalism is dead, and we have an opening to produce something new. We have a chance to create a new future, and I think institutions like ESRA are going to be central to this project. Thank you.